Thank you, Eric. Good morning to everyone who is coming on to the AgMIP8 virtual web shop session, which is the AgMIP GRA workshop on modeling, mitigation, and adaptation co-benefits, which we call MACB. So when you hear MACB, it's that long phrase is what it stands for. Welcome to everybody. We have a wonderful workshop planned for this morning in New York and for whatever time zone you are in. I'm going to share my screen and just give a very brief introduction. And with the help of Hayden Montgomery from GRA. So let me see if I can get this. Yes, here we are. So we see this is the workshop that you've logged into. We want to start by describing the GRA AgMIP partnership. We're just from the AgMIP side, we are a global network of over 1,000 foods, agriculture, and food system modelers. The work that we've primarily done is on the adaptation side, and but our one of our Jean-Francois Susanna, a principal in GRA, is a principal leader. Is he said, why don't you explore a partnership with GRA, because GRA has been focused primarily on mitigation. So we pursued that and have a formal partnership now. And this work on bringing mitigation and adaptation and the modeling of those co-benefits together is really the outcome of this partnership. So I now want to turn to Hayden Montgomery, who is the special representative of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. That's the full title. And have him describe it. It has 64 member countries, and it's just, from the AgMIP side, we're thrilled about the partnership and this exciting activity to come from it. Hayden, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. Good morning, everybody, or evening or afternoon, wherever you are. Look, we're really pleased to have this workshop taking place against all the odds. As Cynthia mentioned, as of 2019, the AgMIP and the GRA formed a formal partnership. It actually happened, I think, just prior to the council meeting of the GRA, which was in Indonesia in October last year. And then in one of our research group meetings earlier this year, in March, in the Netherlands, in Wageningen, which was our integrated research group meeting, there was a very good discussion about what activities could take place within the context of that partnership between the GRA and AgMIP. The GRA in its charter identifies explicitly within its core objectives the need to promote synergies between adaptation and mitigation efforts. In the current discussions within the membership of the GRA for its new strategic plan, which would be from 2020 to 2025, or 2021 to 2025, it has also reinforced a very strong interest from the members and partners to do more in this whole area of adaptation mitigation. So it's really great to have this partnership and to be able to have this workshop. And the idea of this workshop was discussed in detail in March, as I said, originally to take place in the margins in New York of the AgMIP meeting, and then the rest is history, of course. Here we are virtually. I'll let Cynthia talk about the specific objectives of this workshop, but just to reiterate our pleasure to have this partnership and to see concrete activities taking place already, and I'm sure it will be very productive. And it's been a long-standing interest to try and do more on this interface between the two sides of the same coin, as we often talk about in agriculture with adaptation mitigation, and really try and understand the implications and greenhouse gas emissions of these different food production scenarios that you develop in the context of the various climate scenarios and the models. So I'm sure it's going to be a very fruitful discussion over the next few hours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hayden. Yes, so let's turn now to what with GRA and our workshop introduction by our co-leaders, whom I'm going to introduce very shortly. You're going to reiterate this, but just to say right from the right from the get-go of the workshop, the beginning, what the activities that GRA and AgMIP have basically agreed on through this partnership. To develop a modeling framework and protocols. That's what AgMIP does for determining mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. And there were 3 steps in this process. One was a scoping exercise and workshop planning. We can put a check mark besides that. I should have put a check mark on that. The second was to hold a workshop, which we were just so pleased that we were able to do despite the coronavirus pandemic, to focus on drafting the framework and the protocols and planning regional pilot projects. And then the third is to go forward to really conduct the regional proof of concept pilot studies in agricultural regions around the world. With that, I want to introduce our co-leaders and turn it over to them for the workshop. They are Sonali McDermott and Roberto Valdivia. Sonali is a climate scientist, modeler, and her institutional role is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU. She focuses on the intersection of climate, agriculture, and land-atmosphere interactions. In regard to AgMIP, she served as the climate co-lead for the AgMIP's regional integrated assessments in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She also was the co-lead of the Global Modeling Initiative that also involved modelers all around the world. And she is part of the NASA Goddard. We're at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and there she works on the global climate model as well. So she's deep into the interaction. So we're really, but has also worked very much in India with Gita. That you're going to hear about that work on our regional integrated assessment we call RA. Turning to Roberto Valdivia. He's assistant professor at the Department of Applied Economics in Oregon State University. And he is, very importantly, the co-leader of the AgMIP regional economics team. And he's worked in Latin America and in Africa and Asia, and really brings together the regional economics work at the smallholder level, the household level, the farming system level, which is so important to further this work on integrating the co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation. So, and I just have to say, TOAMD, you're going to be hearing that. That's the model that Roberto and John Antle have developed that will be, I'm sure, a key part of the modeling framework that we're going to be discussing. So with that, Sonali and Roberto, over to you. Thank you so much for leading the workshop.
Thank you very much, Cynthia and Hayden, for that introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I'm presuming you can see my screen now. So we're going to give a brief introduction to the session, the goals of the session, and what our expected outcomes are, and some framing as we move into the next set of panel discussions. So we'll make this fairly brief, but we'll return to a lot of these ideas and concepts at the end of the workshop to kind of help structure our discussion and kind of synthesize some key points. So there is an increasing emphasis across research, stakeholder, decision-making, policy-making communities to identify interventions within the agriculture and food system that simultaneously target mitigation and adaptation, and to evaluate the resulting co-benefits from doing both in order to promote their implementation. And so we sort of see this nexus emerging, right, as agriculture plays into, for example, countries' nationally determined contributions in order to meet the Paris Agreement from a mitigation standpoint. As we start to look at the adaptation component, you know, one of the things that AgMIP does and that we've done in our regional integrated assessments is to assess trade-offs So these can be things like, how does achieving mitigation and adaptation result in co-benefits or trade-offs across the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, or other much more localized or regional considerations. And now is a really great time to be exploring this. Our tools are progressing, the development of those tools are progressing. We have an eye towards data collection. And recently there's been an emergence of new policy initiatives. For example, in the United States, there's been a major push for something like a Green New Deal that kind of synthesizes these mitigation, adaptation, and intersectional issues that need to be addressed. So climate change now is no longer about addressing just one thing. It's about addressing everything together in a comprehensive way. And I know that there are similar policy initiatives being put forth across the world, and we've heard about them over the course of this week. So with that in mind, we just want to review our workshop goals very briefly and the format. So as Cynthia mentioned, and we're going to state more explicitly now, our goals are firstly to initiate a discussion of AgMIP-GRA, of a potential AgMIP-GRA modeling framework for MACB, or Mitigation Adaptation Co-Benefits. We'd like to plan for a peer-reviewed journal piece for the AgMIP8 AGU special collection, specifically on the rationale and protocols for this MACB framework. So that as an outcome that you can reference and point to, I think would be really, we think would be very helpful in kind of setting the stage for this partnership and research. And then develop a set of pilot projects to test the MACB framework and protocols comprised of selected regions and to contrast these across different cropping systems, agro-ecosystems, and across different challenges that can be very regionally dependent. And so this lends itself very much to the format and outcomes of the workshop, which, as you can see, will take a very regional, the discussions will be very regionally focused. So the format of this workshop, we'll first talk about the regional context specifically, challenges and needs in these contexts for launching MACB projects. We'll talk about applications of existing models towards MACB, so looking at mitigation adaptation simultaneously, and the challenges to both MACB modeling and data collection. We'll then move into the global context and talk about the global landscape of MACB research and potential opportunities and emerging efforts. And then we'll move into the breakout session where we'll be actively working together to brainstorm potential regional inroads for MACB modeling. And so that will be the very interactive component of this workshop. But we'll have time for discussion across each of these things. And then finally, as Cynthia mentioned, our workshop outcomes specifically are to work towards developing a framework and draft protocols and to consider our plans for regional pilots. Okay, so for now, I'm actually going to switch over to Roberto very quickly to talk about the framework and protocols as we've used them in our regional context, and then we'll come back and move into the first panel. So Roberto, would you like to share your screen and talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy, and hi, everybody. Before diving into the specifics of the workshop, I just wanted to make a couple points to keep in mind in our discussions today. First, when we talk about co-benefits, it's inevitable to talk about trade-offs and synergies. And there are multiple dimensions that need to be taken into account, right? In the figure that you see here, we have the environmental, social, economic dimensions. You can say it's the three pillars or the dimensions of sustainability. So for example, when there is a change in economic conditions, there could be trade-offs among the indicators. Or when there is an improvement in the system's performance, either by a new technology or a policy or institutional innovation, there could be also trade-offs or synergies. So that's why I think we need a framework, protocols, data, models that allow us to capture and quantify the potential trade-offs and synergies. And as Cynthia said in the morning, that's exactly what AgMIP does, right? Creating these protocols using data and models. So the AgMIP Regional Integrated Assessment Framework, which has been implemented in several countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And again, as Cynthia said, mostly we're looking at adaptations, can be used to assess mitigation adaptation co-benefits. And I'm not going to go in detail in this complex figure, but in general terms, moving from top to bottom, we have from the global to national and local drivers. And then if we go to the left column, we have all the biophysical models and data. The right column, it's all the socioeconomic models and data. And then one thing that is important, especially in this kind of assessments, like looking forward assessment like climate change, pathways and scenarios play a key role. And that is being represented here in the column in the middle. And so you can find these protocols in the AgMIP website. So we think that this could be a good place to start when we are talking about protocols and models and data. So a few things to keep in mind during this workshop would be the multiple dimensions that can generate trade-offs and synergies, the indicators that we want to use, and they need to account for the relationships across scales. So with that, back to you, Sonali.
Great, thank you.
And my screen share.
Okay. All right. So with that, we just wanted to raise a few key questions. So we'll move into the panel in just a minute. But we had a call last week with some of the panelists that you'll hear from today, and some interesting questions came up that we thought we would just put forth now for all of you to think about as we move through the sessions this morning and into the breakouts later this morning. And these are just a few overarching questions. There are many, many questions. So there are probably more that many of you could add to here or have been thinking about. So just think about this as a sampling. So firstly, a question came up: what constitutes a co-benefit exactly? And one of the things that we discussed is that this will probably, so for example, achieving some of the SDGs simultaneously or all of them. So that's one example in a broader context, but we also expect that co-benefits will likely span a range of outcomes from biophysical and biochemical, water conservation, biodiversity conservation, all the way over to the socioeconomic. So looking at resilience to shocks, climate shocks or otherwise. Co-benefits can obviously be global, targeting some of the planetary boundaries, and or highly regionally dependent. And so we expect that in the regional discussions today that the co-benefits will be very specifically defined to those contexts. And so we need protocols that can be and model frameworks that are adaptable to really be exploring those context-specific co-benefits. In addition to that, against what baselines should we be measuring progress to achieve both mitigation, adaptation, and these co-benefits, particularly when these objectives span multiple scales. So if you're talking about very regionalized or localized co-benefits or adaptation, right? How do you measure that and weigh that against mitigation, which of course is going to be very much a problem of scale. And then finally, who are the end users of such information, right? Who is being targeted with the potential outputs and outcomes from modeling assessment that we would do for MACB in these regions? Something else to think about as we're kind of developing this. Okay, so with that, just again, some context for you to think about as we move through this, we'd like to move into our first panel. And so I'll quickly give an introduction. I'm actually going to just blow this up a little bit. I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers And then we'll talk a bit about the questions that we'll be asking them, and then we'll move right into it. We're going to be moving in this order. So our first speaker is Dr. Geeta Lakshmi Velingiri, who I know quite well. And she is the Director of Crop Management at Tamil Nadu Agricultural University in Southern India in Tamil Nadu State. Dr. Velingiri has served as the PI of the AgMIP South India team and our phases 1 and 2, which spanned about 7-8 years, of the UK AID funded regional integrated assessments, which Roberto just presented a bit of our protocols from. And our focus is in crop modeling and agroclimatic research. So welcome, Geeta. And if you want to turn your camera on so people can see you, that would be great. I would also like to introduce Dr. Maivan Trin, who's an Associate Professor of Environmental Modeling and Climate Change, and the Director General of the Institute of Agricultural Environment, Vietnam Academy of Agricultural Sciences, then the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam. He holds a PhD in resource conservation and production ecology and has worked extensively in agricultural extension, soil conservation, and environmental and climate change modeling. He's currently been working on crop modeling, greenhouse gas inventories, developing mitigation and adaptation measures towards the INDC for the agricultural sector across 8 agro-ecosystems in a number of provinces in Vietnam. So welcome. I'd like to also introduce Dr. Francisco Meta, who is a professor of the Facultad de Agronomía Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He was the first Director General of the Center for Global Change at the university, which is an interdisciplinary research center, and a co-director for AquaSec, a water security center of excellence in the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. He's a lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land and the forthcoming IPCC 6th Assessment Report. His areas of research are climate risk management, impacts of climate variability and change on water resources and agricultural systems, and he holds a PhD in atmospheric sciences from Cornell University. Lastly, but of course not least, is Dr. Sabina Homan-Kiti, who is a social scientist in the research team market institution, nutrition and diversity, or MIND program, the research program innovation systems for drylands, ISD, and the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, or ICRSAT, in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. Her research, which uses economic modeling and scenario development, focuses on dryland ecologies, food systems, multi-stakeholder innovation and inclusiveness approaches. Her work is mostly in Southern Africa and has included market-oriented diversification and integration of crop livestock systems, nudging sustainability transitions for smallholders, and devising climate change adaptation strategies. So a big welcome to all of our panelists who will be speaking towards examples of MACB projects within their regions and contexts. And I'll highlight that these regions are enormous, and we are very much aware of that. And so our speakers will be speaking to a few of the projects that they're aware of, but we'd also like to solicit from our other participants, all of you sitting out there today, that if you know of others, please come forth and let us know. That's something we'd like to discuss as we move into this. Okay, so the questions that our panelists will be speaking to right now are these 3 broadly. Firstly, what are some example mitigation and adaptation challenges in your regions? Secondly, what are ongoing mitigation and adaptation projects that you're aware of? And how could modeling specifically be used to improve them, right? Really capitalizing on what AgMIP has to offer and what we do. And thirdly, if there are not projects that you know of or that haven't quite taken off yet, what are the potential pilot projects that could be really useful to respond to MACB challenges within your region, and how might AgMIP frameworks and protocols help you towards this end? So with that, we'll go in order of our panelists. So starting with Geeta, Dr. Velingiri, and how we're going to work this very quickly for our panelists. If you weren't there earlier, I'm going to go off camera and I'll come back on at about the 6 to 7 minute mark, which gives you about a minute to finish up. So once you see me pop up again, look out for me. You'll need to sort of wrap up your talk on those 3 questions. So Geeta, I will stop sharing my screen now and I will allow you to share your screen. Please go ahead, you have the floor for the next 7 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Sonali, for this great opportunity. And I'm really grateful for the AgMIP leaders and the AgMIP team for giving me this opportunity for presenting the case on mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. As an introduction, in our case, 92% of the farmers are smallholder farmers, and they are accounting for 61% of the total holdings. Most of the smallholder farmers are ill prepared for the challenges of adapting to increased frequency and intensity of extreme climatic events. The major reason is low education level, low income, limited land area access, poor access to technology, market, and credits. Focus on ecosystem-based adaptation practices is essential to help the smallholder farmers for ensuring their farm-based livelihoods and increasing food security under climate variability. So the major hypothesis we want to work with is adaptation of ecosystem-based climate resilient technologies would result in sustainable food production, enhance buffering capacities against extreme climatic events, and enhance adaptation and mitigation co-benefits among the smallholder farmer who form the biggest contingency in our region. So we all know that the GHG emission is mainly from the agriculture sector, which comes out through many ways: soils, enteric fermentation of methane, rice methane emission from the rice field, biomass burning, and fertilizer through everything. So mainly 45% comes out as nitrous oxide and 55% comes out as methane. How best we can reduce this? So for which we need to mainly adapt to climate smart agriculture technologies. So which actually gives sustainable increase in the productivity and income of the farm. It increases the resilience against the changing climate and also reduces the greenhouse gas emission. So some of the climate smart agriculture practices that we follow in our region for adaptation and mitigation, I have listed down here. Addressing the drivers of vulnerability. How can we do that? First thing is by income diversification, for which we are suggesting integrated farming system. So cultivating crops as well as rearing animals, that's what we mean by integrated farming system. Other thing is agro-based livelihood. For example, the raw material that comes out from the one segment of agriculture could be used as a raw material for another important agro-based activity. One such activity I can quote is mushroom cultivation. Then the second one is community-based risk management. Maybe this, we have to have the community level adoption. One good example is, it is the nursery. Complete paddy nursery could be raised in one field that could be shared among the farmers. Then other important thing is risk transfer mechanism, that is weather-based crop insurance. This again is one of the adaptation technology we advocate to the farming community. The second level is building response capacity. This is the major thing where our modeling component lies with. So first thing is we have to enhance our soil health. For that, the soil erosion has to be reduced, for which we are going for contour farming, crop rotation, mixed cropping, intercropping, mulching, organic manure application, bunding, etc. So for these things, we do not have much capability of our models to handle these things. So there is a lot of scope for improving the model capability, especially to handle the mixed cropping situation as well as intercropping situation. As far as Indian context is concerned, the farms holdings are very small and the farmers go always with some intercropping, which assures their farm income. Then the second one is improving water use efficiency. This we can do it through many ways. The first way is now people are moving towards the drip irrigation and drip fertigation and also through micro irrigation methods. So we need to have some mechanism to include this particular practice into our modeling capability. The other thing is, like in the system of rice intensification, we go with alternate wetting and drying practice that also need to be integrated. Then managing climate risk, mainly response farming. Here, what I mean to say is we have to have some integration of weather forecast information as well as climate forecast information integrated into the biophysical model so that we have the ability to capture the benefits of weather forecasting into the system of cropping. So these are all some of the examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is an indicative list only. Coming to the mitigation part, there are three ways we can do the mitigation. One is reducing the emission. Second one is avoiding the emission. Third one is removing the emission. So for reducing the emission, minimal soil disturbance, either zero tillage or minimum tillage, and then grazing management, integrated nutrient management, livestock feeding, all those things comes under reducing emission. The other important thing is precision farming. So here we give the nutrients and water as and when the plant requires in small quantities. So this we need to integrate in our modeling capacity. And coming to the avoiding emission, energy usage, mainly renewable and biofuel, and reducing post-harvest losses. These are coming under avoiding emission. Then removing emission, incorporation of crop residue. Now in India, there is the biggest problem of biomass burning. So now if we could incorporate the crop residue, and then that adds the biomass and it resolves the problem as well. Agro-forestry and mangroves in coastal area, these are all some of the mitigation that is in practice in India. I just want to give just two case studies, wherein one case study which we have been propagating to a greater extent, SRI in rice, that is system of rice intensification. So we have got 4 or 5 component technologies, which is not actually sensed by the model. But the advantage of this system of rice intensification is it uses less water, produces more yield. The major issue is no modeling capability to include in the alternate management practices, which needs models to assess the ecosystem benefits as well. The second case, which is very important, is agroforestry. The more advantages, it provides better microclimate for the crops under the forest ecosystem, means under the tree crops. It produces more yield, and it has also an alternate income through wood, fodder, and fuel. But the issues is, again, no modeling capabilities to include the alternate management practices and ecosystem benefit assessment. So the way forward is, this is my last slide. So our key objectives for the future project is to identify and test possible ecosystem-based adaptation practices for increasing the resilience of small farm holders, agricultural production system to climate shocks in the pilot regions, to quantify their impacts and synergies of identified practices on crop productivity and ecosystem services, to develop framework for scaling up the use of ecosystem-based adaptation practices in smallholders' agricultural system. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you very much, Geeta, for that pretty comprehensive presentation. So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to the next speaker, and then we'll reserve a few minutes for discussion afterwards. But if you have questions, please do put them into the Q&A, and our speakers will be looking for that to address them directly. So next up, we would like to welcome Dr. Mai Van Trinh from Vietnam to speak to the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian context. I think Geeta will start sharing her screen in just a second.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Geeta. And Dr. Trinh, please, you can share your screen now, and you have the floor.
Yeah, Sonali, have I done that?
Yes. So it looks like your screen is off. Dr. Trinh, if you'd like to share your screen, and you have the floor now to speak.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen. It's perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Sonny. I would like to have some talk about the mitigation and adaptation co-benefit. So I have only 5 minutes, so I try to concentrate in what I want to say. For the challenges, you see that the mitigation and adaptation co-benefit, it can calculate for the single pilot or the project. But in case if we have a very high investment, or we can invest, invest for the regional project, for example, for district, for the province, or even for the watershed scale. With for example, we have a lot of construction or improvement of dike, of irrigation systems, or the dike for preventing of zone intrusion. So it includes a lot of things, not only mitigation and adaptation, but we say that it's no regrets investment. So maybe the cost and the economic, it's very difficult to calculate. Mitigation and mitigation is very small aspect in that areas, and adaptation is the most important. That's in that one. The second one is the when we have a new systems. For example, in Mekong River deltas, they have a very big movement of converting rice system to rice stream systems with and without investment. So this one, sometimes we don't. This is a new system coming with new no emission factor for the mitigation activities. So we have no information to simulate mitigation and adaptation at the same time. So this one is it's still challenging. We try to calculate, we try to estimate the mitigation potential by using some default and some emission factors from somewhere, but not directly from the field. That's what we don't have information to fit the model for the simulation. The third case is that we have a lot of perennial crop and fruit trees, and this one is a very few crop included in the crop modeling and GG emission calculations. So maybe we can use the most way we do is for the IPCC guideline, but we don't have a biophysics model to simulate that one. That one is very challenging because in Mekong River deltas they have a lot of perennial crop and fruit crop now is raising because of zone intrusion. The fourth system is livestock. As we try to work deeply on the livestock mitigation, but mostly for example in Vietnam, we mostly based on IPC 1996 revised, sometimes for the IPCC 2006, but that is only for the default or for the default emission factors. But we don't have, as I know, we try to use a PC David model, but I think it's still limited for somewhere. The fifth case, we have a lot of problem soil for example, saline soil and brown soil and acid sulfate soil. We have about more than 1 million hectares in Mekong River deltas in Vietnam. It also had need to apply, for example, alternative irrigation for saving water or for reducing methane emissions. So that one also have challenges for the adaptation. The secret one is we have now we increasing number of variety with high tolerable genotype. For example, tolerable for the flood, tolerable for the zone, for the drought. This one is we don't have actually, I don't find a very good type model to simulate the benefit from the both mitigation and adaptation. I can't move my slide forward.
Sometimes it helps to re-click on the correct screen if you're using arrows.
It like seem to be hanging.
Yeah, just click directly on the slide.
I cannot quit it.
Okay, let me try something.
Maybe you could try. Yeah, okay. Yeah. For the third slide. Yeah, that's one. Yeah, I have some case for the mitigation activities we got from the NDC. So we have analyzed a lot of mitigation and adaptation benefit. For example, the first option is like alternative wet and dry for the rice soil. The mitigation here is reducing methane emission, and the adaptation is here, and co-benefits like saving water, adapt to less water resource in the future, and also the IPCC technology is mid-season drainage. We also have both mitigation of reducing methane emissions and adaptation of saving water, improving extreme climate tolerable, or increasing yield and quality. The new system of converting dry to rice stream is also reducing methane emissions, and they have a lot of co-benefit like adapt to the soil intrusion in low-lying rice paddy field, increasing labor efficiencies, and a very high income. I think sometimes they have 10 times of income compared to the rice production. And they have a very effectively use of natural resource, because the land become slight, and so they use very effectively. Also, the low effective price rice, they can convert to the upland crop because of no irrigation. So one way they reduce methane emission, and one way where they adapt for the drought, sunlight, and soil intrusion conditions. They increase the value added and very higher income, and they very diversifying products and market. So that one is very big movement in the central highland and mountainous areas in Vietnam. For the livestock, they improve the cattle diet, so they balancing carbon and nitrogen in the good ratio of, for example, 25. They can increase not only reduce methane emission, but they increase a lot of meat and milk yield. So this one is a very good co-benefit. And for example, the last but not least one is to reuse of crop residues. This one is for example, in Vietnam, they have about 100 million tons of crop residues per year. So if they, in the past, 70% of this mass amount is the open burning in the field, but now they are not allowed to burn, and they need to use it effectively. So they reduce methane emission and increase crop yield, improve soil fertility, and mitigate pollution, and also enhance tolerable. And the first and the last, not showing in the slide, but like dripping irrigation for coffee together with the fertilizer, they can reduce a lot of N2O emission, but also they save about 30% of fertilizer, 40% of water, and 80% of labor. So this one is very, very high benefit and co-benefit for production. But because of very high cost, you know, it's about 3,000 hectares, 3,000 US dollar per hectares. So that's, in this options, we already, sorry, backward. One slide back. We already use model to simulate, for example, we use DNDC for simulate the methane and N2O emission. We use a DSAT for simulate the crop yield and soil fertility. We also use aqua crop, and we also use AgJack from FAO to estimate the co-benefit and co-benefit from the clay nutrients. But still, many parameters we have not done, we have not simulated yet because it's not included in the model. So maybe we use the next phase. Next, please. We have many projects, but here is one project. My institute be assigned as a verifier for low emission rice cultivation supported by World Bank. It carry out in 8 different countries, in which Vietnam is one of the part of the project. So we have different competitors to showing the mitigation technology, and then we verify what the technology can mitigate emission, GG emission. And so we have 3 categories. One is the reduction of emission and increase of crop yield and number of farmers to involved in the project. So at the end of the project, we collected all information about the GG emission, the crop yield, and also number of farmers. And the competitors become the first, the second, and the third one, with they will have a prize. And this season, this year, they will have a final prize for the winner with about 750,000 US dollar for the first position. They already involved about 6,000 farmers to apply mitigation technology. So this one is one of the project to use like a pull mechanism to get the farmer to follow it. So that's one is one of the project. So we have another project, but I will tell you later. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Chen. That was great. And like you said, this is all these are all topics that I think would be very fruitful to bring up in the breakouts. So thank you for that. Next, we would like to move on to Dr. Francisco Meta. And I think you are able probably to share your screen now if you would like to, but you have the floor, Francisco, so please.
Francisco, I think you're on mute.
Now, can you confirm that you are watching my slides?
Yes. Yeah, we can
Wonderful.
see you.
Thanks so much. I wasn't aware that I was on mute. I like to thank the opportunity to talk to you about the modeling, mitigation, and adaptation co-benefits And I would be very pretentious if I want to call myself an expert on what everything is going on in Latin America. So I'm just going to give you my personal perspective about this, and probably share the experience that we are leading in Chile that is connected to developing tools specifically for the purpose of helping the country to achieve a certain goal in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So the next slide shows that the different countries in Latin America have a different participation of agricultural sector in terms of emissions. Some countries like Argentina, and I probably would put Uruguay in that category, are probably the main sector responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. Others like Brazil, Colombia, and Peru have a different participation, and Chile is a slightly smaller because the size of the agriculture, although very sophisticated and high value agriculture, is not as important as it is in other contexts and countries. When you talk about co-benefits and the use of different mechanisms to model and assess the impacts of introduction of mitigation measures, you see that the experience in terms of the number of papers produced tell us that the South American region is not probably one in which this has been taking place significantly. We are in the same order of magnitude of Oceania and Africa, and probably the ones that are leading this are the Europeans. Although agriculture, as you see here on the right, is identified as a sector in which you can have tools and you have the potential to do both, not only adaptation, but also mitigation as well. And the opportunities to assess the co-benefits are quite significant. One conclusion that comes from studies from Rojas et al. That follow a process called mitigation and adaptation plans and scenarios called MAPS is that the Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, and even Peru are always in the study phase. The different mitigation actions that are being highlighted as significant for the agricultural sector are usually in the category of under consideration, and very rarely they're in the process of actual implementation. And probably what is going on here and what is needed is that we need tools to do assessment in a more quantitative manner. So this workshop is particularly important to achieve that. So going into the specifics of Chile, Chile has a situation like any other country in which climate change represents certain threats. One important threat is the reduction in precipitation almost in the entire country, which means that we are particularly vulnerable in terms of water resources. So the government, the Ministry of Environment, invited us. I belong to this Center of Global Change, Centro de Cambio Global, that is in the center of the slide. Invited us to undertake a very ambitious project called the AgMIP project. AgMIP calls from the Atlas of Climate Risks. And what we did was to develop a collection of maps that come from different sources, and some of them from very quantitative analysis, to analyze the different risks associated to climate change, following a chain impact approach in which you clearly highlight or identify the threat, then the exposure, and finally the sensitivity. For the case of agriculture, I was leading this, it was fantastic work that we did, developing a 5-kilometer resolution climate grid combined with the different soil maps for physical properties and the development of the crop simulation models for the main crops. So you see a quite dense and rich modeling framework so we are able to produce very detailed information about potential risks of climate change and impacts on crop productivity. We follow a calibration protocol in places in occasions in which it was possible. In other, it was more a supervised and educated guess according to knowledge of experts, but we were able to model wheat, beans, maize, and potatoes for the entire country, and also produce changes in adaptation practices like incorporation of irrigation and also modification of sowing dates. For the case of livestock, we follow a pretty simple approach, developing a crop simulation model applied for pasture lands, and then a simple stocking density model. So we were able to calculate changes in the carrying capacity of the pasture lands in southern Chile for milk cows, for beef cattle, and also for sheep. And finally, for fruit trees, we were not able to do the same kind of modeling approach, so such detailed models. So we follow a niche model type of strategy for cherries, almonds, walnuts, apples, and of course for wine. So what we are able to assess is changes in suitability in terms of potential climate changes. So this is an example of the maps that we are able to produce. You see the different regions of the central part of Chile, the most agriculturally developed, and every single dot that you see there is a result of a simulation. So you see the degree of variability from north to south and from coast to the Andes, and you are able to identify not only the risks, but also potential opportunities for crop productivity and enhanced productivity. This was very important for governmental authorities, and they're very pleased to see the results that we were able to produce. But the second part of the story is that the president of Chile declared that Chile wanted to be carbon neutral by 2050. And I apologize because this slide is taken from a presentation from the Ministry of Environment, so it's in Spanish, but it's not that difficult to follow. That the red line shows the current trend or the reference scenarios in terms of emissions, and the green one is the deviation from the trend in order to match the available carbon capture capacity that we have associated to forest growth. So the idea is to develop all the mechanisms and strategies that allow us to produce the deviation from the scenario of reference in terms of mitigation, and produce not only this as an assessment of feasible opportunities, but in a more engineering fashion and considering some economics here. So by incorporating these abatement curves so that you pick up the ones that are most economically efficient. I recall the introduction of Roberto here. So this is one of the dimensions. Probably the other thing that we need to incorporate are the trade-offs associated to ecosystems and the environment in general. So the Inter-American Development Bank set up a project in which we are doing different modeling efforts for mitigation. The starting point are the results of this AgMIP process and very detailed modeling of crop productivity, but we're considering like 6 different strategies One is regenerative grazing that allow us to have soil carbon capture, no-till and the incorporation of residues, soil carbon capture as well, precision agriculture as a way to minimize the use of resources, cover crops, both for carbon capture and also for nutrient management, climate services to reduce risks for climate shocks, and some economics and biophysical modeling of nitrogen use. We selected these strategies after a workshop in which we interview more than 40 different experts and try to follow a framework of assessing not only the feasible options, but also the trade-offs associated in terms of environmental indicators and also the economics. So here we're starting to work with carbon capture models, simple models to assess what would be the impact of enhanced carbon organic material in the soils based on the incorporation of residues. These residues are assessed via the models that are fine-tuned with the different climate scenarios. So it's a couple strategy to develop the quantitative metrics for the assessment of the potential of carbon capture mitigation and also the effects on adaptation. So for further development of this, I would say that we definitely need a little bit more in terms of tools and protocols for the evaluation of impacts of mitigation measures in terms of enhancing adaptation and increasing resilience in agricultural systems, and also on the potential side effects or non-desired effects on the environment that those may have in the future. So with that, and I like always to give acknowledgement to the funding sources of our work. I go back to you, Sonali, and looking forward to more discussion within the breakup sessions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Francisco. That was really great to see. And also, just as a quick word, there are a few questions in the Q&A box for our panelists. Actually, for Dr. Sita, Trin, and Francisco, there are all questions there for you. So please do take a look at those panelists and answer those, and we'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A as well. So thanks very much, and I think now we'll move on to Sabine. Are you there? I think you came on. Ah, yes. Okay, I can see you coming online now. Great. So you can feel free to share your screen, and you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would like to share my screen and then perhaps get out of my video because of my poor internet connectivity. Yeah, similarly, I would like to share some thoughts with you about the decision context about mitigation, adaptation, co-benefits with regards to Africa. Myself, I'm operating from Southern Africa, semi-arid crop livestock systems. And I thought it's important to share that Africa as a continent is perhaps, especially the agriculture, most severely affected by climate change, already having very high vulnerability levels. While at the same time, people don't have access to electricity, emission is actually quite low, but it's actually the dynamics of all these threats in food systems that threaten our efforts to build resilience through co-benefits from climate change adaptation and mitigation. having the decision context in mind, we find actually really limited capacity and coordination across sectors, including agriculture, that would allow us to harvest the mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. I'm saying this to point out that as much as we may think and model adaptation and mitigation per se, it might be the co-benefits that would allow us to raise funding and investment and buy-in into adaptation and mitigation. Yeah, and with this in mind, I'm sorry to share with you this enormous list, but I just thought with stakeholders in Zimbabwe about what are the real challenges with regards to implementing mitigation adaptation co-benefits. And yeah, it was a huge list we came up with. Of course, the complexity of threats and non-climatic drivers like poor governance, etc., affecting the ability to really influence, then the low adaptive capacity of institution assets and collective action. And while we are actually living in an environment where we depend much on climate sensitive activities like agriculture, predominantly based on very narrow food diets, agriculture, monocultures dominating the landscape, etc. Then at a higher level, we look at the different time and scale horizons. We feel that global policy frameworks are not often well translated to be understood by local networks, and therefore the buy-in and the response to developmental needs on the ground is actually limited. And hence, I found really little understanding of mitigation and adaptation co-benefits or policies that help integrating the two. So there seems still like very separate pillars of engagement. We have to also be taking account of the variability of understanding, different people understanding different things, working in different sectors, especially in agriculture, looking at high-risk semi-arid areas. We find, for instance, even though understanding agroecological solutions would be on the long term more sustainable, but there's also a push from industrial agriculture to predominate these areas, making it very risky and making it difficult or burdening the mitigation part. I also wanted to highlight, as amongst the earlier drivers showed, that we find growing middle classes where people are asking actually for healthier food, for more diversified foods at a reduced food mile. But these elements are only very slowly incorporated in adaptation processes. And most importantly, underlying, we found this dichotomy where we find on the mitigation side, they are the methodology, the national inventories, but they rely on default emission factors on estimating greenhouse gas emissions. For example, the definition of forest might be very different in Zimbabwe versus Ghana versus anywhere else. And yet we rely on the same factors against adaptation, where we felt there's really a lack of consistent procedures and metrics to assess vulnerability and adaptation potential from context to higher scale. So we really need to look at the usefulness of data to value attribution to co-benefits. And last but not least, we really want to highlight these systemic issues in institutions and policies that would probably hinder us to get to these win-win co-benefits. I think we still also face there is often a donor-driven investment, with then resulting in insufficient support by governments. And we continue working in silos, rather really going for what do countries need in their policy formulation, along with real participatory learning experiences. And this again reinforces our limited capacity, despite the high relevance of adaptation, especially in Africa. And so this just quickly, that we see interrelationships between, if we don't align our interests and there's inconsistency in implementation, co-benefits not being adopted to national conditions, of course there is losses in efficiency of adaptation. The co-benefits are not really being able to be measured adequately, so they remain underestimated, while co-benefits themselves might be actually greater than the direct investment in mitigation, for example. And that would be actually an argument to support greater investment in mitigation while we still are very much focused on adaptation. So with all that, I'm just giving you a very short overview on the ongoing mitigation adaptation projects, just rough policy overview. So I believe all these countries are on national adaptation roadmaps, reduction of vulnerability, there's slow progress, often lack of capacity to access finance, although we have GEF, UNDP, SCF, really strong projects on drought mitigation and adaptation. The other Green Climate Fund projects established, expanding, supporting national adaptation plans, and they really need modeling support for strong business cases actually to raise the case for certain interventions. And overall, for I would say large parts of Africa, climate smart agriculture has become the leading framework, whereby there's also a very strong effort on rehabilitation of underutilized irrigation, supported by weather, climate information, digital agriculture. And then we believe we really need to relook at, if we want adoption to rise, into what can raise the adoption, the incentives. So the market and finance instruments are really lacking behind in climate smart agriculture programs. On the mitigation side, we have programs, the countries are revising their NDCs, there are the leads starting, there are the READ programs, which are rather patchwork implemented. There's regional market strategy to reduce the energy bill. So overall, we have these mitigation programs, but they are still quite detached from the adaptation efforts, or they could be better integrated. So the gaps in modeling that we see with regards to mitigation is to really get to methods that that assess emission levels at country level, with adaptations, to come up with more robust formats that are country specific, assessing vulnerability and adaptation impacts, especially the cost of adaptation, to really inform the national priorities and policy formulation. So really, we are doing it in the CLARE project, or we're trying to get there, but to really bring this whole modeling in the service of investments. There's always the complaint in modeling that we need to really improve and create co-ownership of local, national, African scientists in the development or in the use of climate scenarios. The same as in the agroecological zonation, like for decisions to understand which areas of similar agroecological conditions could respond under similar climate shocks and climate trends. As I mentioned before, modeling in the purpose of business cases on how can we measure adaptation impacts, water energy consumption and losses, because we know there's huge energy inefficiency, water inefficiency. So how can we bring modeling more into this in the auditing? And of course, the whole modeling should be from the beginning a deliberate effort to build capacity in this co-generation of knowledge, so that we can actually place co-benefits within context and tapping on developmental efforts that are already ongoing. The potential private project, I just came up here with one suggestion, understanding that large parts of Africa, Southern Africa, more than 2/3 of the land are covered by semi-arid areas, where particularly livestock contributes tremendously to emission, while extensive cropping also becomes more difficult, and the whole systems are carried largely by smallholder farmers. So how can we use modeling in decision processes to come up with inclusive crop livestock systems approaches that are directly targeting nutrition, health, income, and all the other development outcomes, understanding that really these integrated crop livestock systems have the highest potential to increase resilience in these dry lands. And some components, without going into details, would be, of course, feed, fodder, reforestation, perhaps not that much for directly mitigation, but for landscape restoration, for feed quality, etc. And the whole water, efficient water harvesting, use of wastewater for improving livestock performance, health management, surveillance, marketing, switch to heat resilient species. So we believe that only if we integrate really the different, very complex issues, we will be able to really support resilience. And of course, crop production is part of this. But because of the mitigation function here, we thought the entry point should actually be livestock if we want to do the mitigation part. I think my last slide got deleted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serena. And this is actually, you know, this is kind of a perfect collection of AgMIP talks spanning the biophysical into sort of the governance, socioeconomic. So thank you for that. I think we have maybe a few minutes for a couple of questions. I see some questions put into the chat. So maybe somebody from the chat who, or rather the Q&A. So maybe somebody from the Q&A might want to offer up and come off mute and actually contribute their question.
They actually can't. Sorry, attendees aren't able to.
Oh, they're not able to, right. Okay, so in that case, I might just read off a couple of the questions. So D. Williams made the comment for the panelists, and I think, Savina, this is sort of in response to a little bit of what you presented. Given all the important work that AgMIP is doing, is anyone looking at measures of government, political infrastructure challenges, and barriers to adoption and support for food system and climate change? One must also consider the social co-benefits, which actually was brought up by some of our panelists in previous discussions, like rural living, environment, poverty, livable wages, health, etc. And so I guess the question largely is how are social co-benefits being considered across these regions, and what is sort of the government political infrastructure that intersects with mitigation and adaptation co-benefits? And Sabina, I think you kind of responded to that very nicely. So I think for Drs. Geeta, Trin, and Francisco, moving away from the biophysical slightly to like how does the policy space enable or hinder development of MACB options, and what social co-benefits are of interest to the regions that you're working in?
If I can comment on that, you know, based on the experience I shared, I'm not sure if we're able to actually model and measure them, but the things that we're looking in very simple terms are impacts on employment, and that those can be, you know, going up or down depending on the adaptation and mitigation measures that you are doing. And there's also something that is the social acceptability or the validation from the community of the measures that you are producing. The one thing, for instance, is not related to agriculture, but there is a big debate ongoing in Chile that the government would like to push reforestation as a mechanism for achieving mitigation, and that is very controversial if that is based on invasive or exotic species that are used for timber production. They would like to see, you know, much more investment on the native forest types, and the one thing that we're looking at is how well received are these measures as a way to perhaps have a sense on the social impact that this will have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for that. And just to Geeta and Trin, would you have comments on this as well too, looking at the governance issues or social co-benefits of your region? Geeta, I see you came off mute, so I'm not sure if...
Yeah, Yes, Sonali. Yeah, I totally agree, because this depends upon the acceptability of the community, whatever the adaptation strategies we follow, and also there should be government support in terms of, because the farmers whom we deal with is small and marginal farmers, so we have to have government support in terms of subsidy and kind of. This is what is happening here.
Great, thank you. There's also a question from Brian Grant that I wanted to put to the panel as well too, and that's how can we better facilitate the development of these models so that they can address the local farming practices that are important for agricultural regions that do not intrinsically have the capability to address these gaps on their own. In other words, support for funding for measurements to address modeling gaps, data availability for global model developers, development of regional modeling and expertise. I think, Savina, you had commented on this a little bit, particularly in terms of co-development of knowledge, and I think this will also be a question that comes up in the modeling panel later, but maybe Savina, if you had a comment to that, given that you had brought that up a bit in your talk.
I would expose this as a challenge without having the answer. I mean, I feel sometimes maybe we need to really refigurate the way how we, that's why I try to say paradigm, how do we operate as researchers, and we should proceed placing our research in the real developmental needs of users. And that would, I mean, the countries are developing decentralized consultative processes in climate change adaptation planning, so we should be more radically involved in these processes and take up the issues that are coming. For now, we're doing it at a very, very small scale. I mean, we are also working on climate smart agriculture has made huge progress in being in the educational systems and the educational curricula of universities. So I think, considering the relevance of these issues, these type of modeling decision procedures should be part of really of national educational programs.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks so much, Savina. So, so I think at least that's it for the questions in the Q&A for now, and there's some other comments. So please, our panelists, be mindful of the Q&A, and please put your comments in there, and that would be great to see. And of course, anyone who has a response to that. So I think at this point, we're running slightly behind, but I think this conversation has been fruitful. We'll turn to the next panel on model tools and data. And I think I will hand it over to Roberto to help introduce that panel.
Yeah, thank you, Sonali. Yeah, actually, the last question was a very good introduction for the next session. Yeah, no, it was, the previous session was really interesting. You know, the panelists showed the different options for mitigation, adaptation strategies, but also the challenges in modeling data, and also the challenges from the policy and markets perspective. So I think that was very interesting. So for the next panel session on models, tools, and data, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Havlik. Peter joined the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IAS, in 2007 as a research scholar with the former forestry program, and now he is the acting director of the IAS Ecosystem Services and Management Program. Within this program, he is the head of the Center for Environmental Resources and Development, where he leads a team of over 20 scientists working on the Global Agricultural and Forest Sector Economic Model, GLOBIUM, a model that was developed by Peter when he started his career at IASA. Since 2011, he has been successful in securing and managing multiple projects with a total funding of around 9 million euros. His research interests are in designing solutions to satisfy the future needs of humanity in terms of food, fiber, and fuel, climate change mitigation, ecosystem services in general, within the limited resources of land and water under climate change. With that, Peter, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Roberto, thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this session on model, tools and data. I find this really exciting moment when we are really bringing together the mitigation and adaptation topics and also the communities, as it is here nicely illustrated by the AgMIP and Global Research Alliance new collaboration. I personally am indeed, as Roberto introduced, coming more from the economics background, and I found it always interesting that I was meeting, even from the same models, different people in the AgMIP community and in the mitigation community. And maybe this is related also to the historical developments. I remember when I started at IASA in 2007, we went to the COP in Bali, and it was almost forbidden to talk about climate change impacts and adaptation. We will mitigate everything. Then the momentum got a little bit lost, and we started to talk only about extreme scenarios of climate change impacts and the need for adaptation. Then with the Paris Agreement, we again went on the completely other side, and we focused on extreme mitigation with very limited climate change impacts. And I think that now, about 5 years after the Paris Agreement has been drafted, we start to find somewhere a middle ground where we understand that we will have to find more complex solution to at the same time provide mitigation and the necessary adaptation to the residual climate change impacts. So I think it's a great moment, and we have the pleasure to welcome 5 excellent panelists. So first, Keith Postien, who is a university distinguished professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences and senior research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. A major focus of his work involves modeling, field measurement, and development of assessment tools for soil carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions from soils. Current research activities include fundamental studies of soil organic matter dynamics and applied research, including improvement of models and inventory methodology used for national greenhouse gas accounts. Then the next panelist is Tao Li, who is a senior scientist at the DNDC Applications, Research and Training, and mainly focuses on the model development and improvement, model applications on ecosystem, and evaluation and management. The third panelist will be Bruno Basso, who is an agroecosystem scientist and University Foundation professor in Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Michigan State University. His research focuses on drivers of spatial and temporal variability of crop yield, water, nutrient fluxes across agricultural landscapes under current and future climates. He is also the chair of a recently formed committee at the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources of the United States National Academy of Sciences to study and advance the science of soil dynamic information systems. Our fourth panelist will be Christoph Müller. Christoph works at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, sometimes called PIC, and there he leads a working group on land use and resilience. He also co-leads the global gridded crop model intercomparison within AgMIP, and is the scientist in chief for the open source dynamic global vegetation crop and hydrology model LPJML, also in Potsdam and PIC. Last, but by far not the least, Pete Smith. Pete Smith is professor of soils and global change at the Institute of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Aberdeen. and Science Director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise, Climate Exchange. His interests include climate change mitigation, soils, agriculture, food systems, ecosystem services, and modeling. Pete has been involved since a very long time in Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and notably he led the work on climate change mitigation in agriculture, forestry, and land in the 4th and 5th assessment reports. Okay, with this, we will start the panelist presentations. The panelists have received the following questions for this session. How does your model handle both mitigation and adaptation processes and their interactions? What are the challenges to modeling MIP8? What data are in hand and what data are needed? What could a modeling protocol entail that would enable multimodal assessment of MIP8? Has your model been linked or coupled with other models, such as economic models, to capture non-biophysical co-benefits? And as I already said, the first panelist is Keith Postian. Keith, please, you as all other panelists have about 8 minutes for your presentation. Thank you for starting.
Thanks, Peter. Can everyone see this?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, good, thanks. Well, thanks Cynthia and Eric and other organizers for opportunity to be part of this workshop. And I'm gonna speak about the descent and century models. And just as, by the way of background, so it's an ecosystem biogeochemical model that does carbon and nitrogen, also phosphorus. It's been around for a long time, since 1987, more or less. It's of course been a lot of developments over the 30 or so years that it's been active. It was developed to do grassland, cropland, forest, savanna systems. The main focus of the model really was originally to look at soil organic matter dynamics and to look at soil organic matter dynamics over long periods of time, hence the name century. But later trace gas emissions were added in as a principal focus, and so the name evolved to descent in the sense that the model moved to a daily time step model in order to capture the more dynamic behavior of things like nitrous oxide and methane emissions. It's been used extensively particularly for soil carbon and greenhouse gas inventory applications at really global to national to farm scale. It has been used for a number of years as part of climate change impact and adaptation studies, but I would say probably the ones that have been the main focus has really been on the strength of the model, looking at soil carbon and greenhouse gas responses in the context of impact and adaptation studies. But also recently, there's been a lot of work done by Dr. Yao Zhang in my group, who has done some very nice work in improving the phenology and the plant dynamics and plant canopy dynamics and water balance and other things, really improve the capability of the model to do, I think a better job at plant and soil responses to climate change impacts. Just, as an example, I'll show some results from a recent paper that Yao published in the Scientific Reports. And this was a regional analysis in the US. And I guess the things to point out, I won't spend a lot of time going into the details here, obviously, but one of the things we wanted to do was look at different GCM scenarios that were downscaled. And, we had Hadley Horton and Dan Bader at Columbia helped us to pick some climate change scenarios, and they're shown here. There's the GFDL model as well as two Japanese GCMs that they had done the work on downscaling, and these were kind of selected to give a kind of a framing of potential climate futures for the Midwest region and in the U.S., kind of the Corn Belt, if you will. And so what we really wanted to do then was to look at with and without adaptation, and we took a pretty simple crack at that, where adaptation really was pretty much restricted to changing the crop varieties to account for the changing climate conditions, as well as the planting date. There's a lot of other stuff one could do, but we started off fairly simply with that. And on the right-hand side, you can see the obvious kind of things that come from these different climates. You see a big change in the genetic space, if you will, for varieties. So that in particular for corn, a major shift northwards in terms of the adaptation of different maturity groups. Just really briefly, so what does it mean then in terms of what do we think that this might mean for soil carbon in particular? That was the kind of the focus of this study. First of all, of course, you have effects on crop yields, and they're the sort of thing that you see in a number of studies. I should mention really briefly that we used a fairly data-rich environment of about 54,000 national resource inventory points within this region to kind of define the baseline management systems and also the soil and climate conditions. So it's a fairly high resolution simulation, and then the data were aggregated up to the county scale. But anyway, as you would expect, if you look at these, let me actually go back one. So the GCM simulations, there was one in particular, the GFDL, which was a much, was kind of a warm and wet, particular increase in precip, whereas the MIROC simulation was much warmer and not quite as much more, increase in precipitation, whereas the MRI model here gave a less of an increase in temperature and a fairly modest increase in soil moisture. Depending on which GCM, maybe not unexpected results that without adaptation, you see crop losses, yield losses, both for corn and soybean. But it depends a lot on the climate scenario that was done. In terms of the soil carbon, the main focus of the study, the baseline contents kind of shown here across this region. The average of all the without adaptation was unequivocally a loss of soil carbon across the region, somewhere on the order of 5-6 or more tons per hectare in the top 20 centimeters. With adaptation, as you might expect also, it didn't completely mitigate the loss, but it did, in some cases, there was a small gain more in the northern part of the region, whereas lower losses below. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the study here, you really see the impact, what's the sensitivity of the estimates of impacts and of different climate change scenarios. It's really, there's tremendous impact of the different assumptions or the different model results on climate outcomes. So there's a huge spread here between the different simulations in terms of, and without adaptation in general, there's losses occurring, as I mentioned before. With adaptation, for the most part, the losses due to climate change are mitigated by the adaptation, but there's a decrease, for one of the systems. Okay, so in terms of, that's an example of how at a regional scale this kind of model can be used. What do I see as the main challenges and kind of critical data needs? I guess I would say the number one thing that strikes me is what I'll call the factorial nightmare of climate change scenarios, management variables, potential adaptive management responses. How do we incorporate all those things in these kinds of analyses? And we need to really be complex enough to be at least quasi-realistic, but you've got to have it simple enough to be interpretable. In terms of data needs, I think in general it is a little bit hard to generalize, but I would say that the data situation has really improved greatly over recent years, both from the standpoint of experimental data and things on soil carbon, trace gas measurements, et cetera. There's been a lot of pulling together of some of these data. The Ag Evidence database came out recently, International Soil Carbon Network, et cetera. But for sure, it's, we need to keep in mind a lot of this, the big advances in data availability and how that helps this kind of modeling has really been to a large extent in the EU, Australia, China, North America. There's been improvements other places, but I still think that experimental data, as well as data on what the management activities are and key biophysical information is really still lacking in the Global South. This particular model, the Century and Dayset model, has been linked in the past, fairly successful with different kinds of models, whether econometric models, partial equilibrium models. And in general, I would say, though, that these have been done in a kind of loosely coupled form in which you use the ecosystem model to essentially generate response functions to feed into the economic model. I think we still haven't really achieved what I would call a sort of a fully coupled ecosystem economic model. That would be an interesting thing to take on. And then finally, I would say that from the standpoint of mitigation, I think it's possible now to take some of these kind of tools, process-based models and databases from remote sensing and lots of other sources, and put those into tools that can be used by non-experts. And I think if we're going to make progress on mitigation and adapting climate smart agriculture, we need to have tools that can be used down at the grassroots levels by folks that are working directly with farmers, by government agencies and others like this. We've been working in the US for a number of years developing systems like this, but I think we're approaching the time and there are efforts undergoing by ourselves and others that are, I think in the very near future will be able to put some of these modeling assessment tools into the hands of folks in most parts of the world. So that's with that, I'll close.
Thanks a lot, Keith, for this encouraging presentation, which nicely illustrates that on the one hand, both on the biophysical side, it is possible to link the mitigation adaptation, that also some links to the, for example, economic models can be established, and especially this richness of the new data, which we really getting available now, which can substantially improve what we did in the past. So thanks a lot for this contribution. And now I would hand over to the next panelist, Tao Li, please.
Press conference, you can see my screen?
Yes.
So we see the presenter view. So if you go to on the top left, it says display settings.
Okay, yeah, display setting, yes.
Yeah, just click that and then do swap. Yeah.
Okay. So I turn off my videos because I was at internet speed. So I hope everyone heard me very well and can see the slides. In the next few minutes, I will try to give you as much information as possible about the DNDC. I maybe I'm not the best person to give the summary about the DNDC because I retired from the International Research Institute and joined the DNDC just 2 years ago. However, I will try my best. So DNDC is a biogeochemical process model. It deals with it includes all components to deal with the soil, plants, and the atmosphere of the continuum. And here's DNDC models more focused on pay much more attention on the soil part. So all process, chemical, physical, and biology process in the soil part was described as very detailedly. However, we are really in the crop and the plants modules, and they also we included all physiological processes, but we try to simplify the descriptions for each process. And then another ways we also try to include many management activities as many as possible in the modeling systems. Try to give them more capability to evaluate this management activity on the effects of management activity on the system. And during from 1992, after the model initiation, so a lot of group use the original DNDC models to do the secondary modification or even rewriting. So they have a lot of subversions. These subversions, some is focused on the different crops or specific ecosystems. So and other part of the subversions is adopted for the region or some country or specific data structures. But here's I try to I'm not trying to classify the subversions, but I just try to put them into the different groups. But some is not really says okay. For example, DNDC CSM is actually the Canadian versions of the DNDC. There are also added additional function to address to give them more detailed descriptions on the soil hydrology process and the soil drainage. In other sense, this one's EFEM versions is linked to the agroeconomic models. Right now, actually, the DNDC can working for almost all terrestrial ecosystems like the forestry, arable land, grassland, wetland, and peat, like a rest field, peat field, and also have the one subversions developed by other groups to deal with the economy. And the DNDC can work on the any schedule, spatial schedule, or the temporal schedule from day to the decades. And so far, the DNDC models has already working for many crops and plants. I think more than 90 crops and plants, from the annual crops to the pre-annual crops, from the agriculture crop to the forestry plants. So I think almost all key agriculture crops and plants, they can be modeling can be simulated by the DNDC. Similar as many other ecosystem models, but the DNDC also asking a lot of data to fit into the model. So the accuracy of the models is totally depend on the data fitting data quality and the quantity. So if we have the higher quality data and a reasonable quantity of the data fit into the model, then with a good calibration and validation, normally they will generate a good output. The output is we will include the plant's growth, plant's yield, biomass, organ biomass, all this kind of things. We also have the detailed output in the soil dynamic, soil parameters. And in other sense, for this core benefits, probably we are more focused on the nitrogen and trace gas emission, nitrogen loss to the environment, water loss, and dissolve the carbon and dissolve the nitrogen into the environment. So here's this is a table we present the performance of the DNDC. However, this is based on our personal judgment. We selected about 100 almost 100 papers from 1,000 papers, in which have the good. We think they have the good calibration in the model. So here is some the key elements, the prediction on some key outputs like the yield, soil carbon, and the greenhouse gas emission. The application of the DNDC model is the same as many other ecosystem models. It's always include the model calibration parameterization process. And this, if you want to understand the uncertainty, identify the source of the uncertainty, you need to through the model validation process. Then after that, you can really use the model to evaluate a different cropping system or different management system or different management activity, how they interact with the systems and how the output changes, how the greenhouse gas emission changes, how the yield and biomass changes. So and here's we see that they included some kind of the crop or genotypical characteristics in the systems, and also we included the source use in the systems, especially for the irrigation water. Like irrigation waters, how much nitrogen in the irrigation water also is in there, and the fertilizer application or radiation, all these kind of chemical factors, and even extreme chemical events like drought, heat, cold, all these kind of things that can be put into the system to evaluate the impacts and the changes, the risks, resilience. And we see that here's almost all key agriculture, agronomy management activities as presented in the model systems. They include the application schedules, such as the dose or application time, application methods, and the intensity, all this kind of things that can present into the system. Then we can evaluate how they affect the yield, biomass, and the soil status, and also finally the greenhouse gas emission and the nitrogen loss into the environment. Right now, we still have a lot. You know, the DNDC is not the perfect models. We think, but we have a lot of considerations, but we face a lot of challenges, especially in funding some early submissions by some other participants. So as is the same sense in our group, we have a lot of things we want to do. We want to solve the shortages in the DNDC. Like right now, we do not have the capability to try address the pest diseases and weeds. During our works into the system, the ecosystem management effects, so we found if we do not have this kind of the capability, generally they have the much bias in the model output. And in other sense, DNDC can't address cropping system, crop rotation, but we are not able to take care about the intercropping. And we're also not able to simulate the fat residues and translocation. We also hope we have the deep coupling with the economic model and to address the core benefit issues. And in other sense, we present some kind of the livestock impacts into the system, especially in the grass and leafy grass and managed grass. So they have the grazing effects on the grasslands, but we are not really included the livestock model into the system, going to able to quantify the greenhouse gas emission and the mass flow, energy flows, and in the whole farming system. You know, so, as a farming systems, they probably include as a different cropping system, agro-forestry or even orchards and farming systems. But that is a piece of the land. We are right now we are not really able to handle it in the whole systems, but we can handle it separately. But we are not really going to handle it as a systems because they have the energy, mass, and other flows between each other. And as the same sense as many other models, we also face the big challenges about the data collection, data quality, data quantity, and also data management in our system. And as Pes said, earlier, Kes said, so right now the data collections has already improved significantly in the recent year, especially as the big data become available, then that will probably this problems will become less restrictive. And in our side, we also want to do some tool development, and that's to address some kind of the special issues or aspects or questions from the customers. In our side, we are work on any kind of the collaboration. We can work together, and we can help to you, and you can also help us to improve our model, and we can give you the tool to do your work as much as what you want. This is my talk. I stop here. I hope I didn't over the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Tao, for the presentation of this another very comprehensive tool, the DNDC model. I was particularly impressed by the number of crops individually you are able to cover with this model, which is really great. And also thanks a lot for bringing up the issue of the pests and diseases. I think that this would be maybe interesting if we have some time at the end to return back to this issue. And so with this, I would like to welcome Bruno Basso. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter, and the organizers for putting together this very interesting session. I will be presenting a very applied mode of models and describing possibility of using data from farmers. The model that I've worked over the years and basically been co-developed for the last 20 years now is the SALUS model, System Approach for Land Use Sustainability. SALUS is the evolution of the CIRRUS model that, as you may know, it was actually started in a more strategic sort of way, funded by the Foreign Agricultural Service and the intelligence of the US to predict how much wheat was produced in Russia during the Cold War. And so Joe Ritchie led that initiative. Later on, I basically trying to add different parts of the model, and actually Keith Bastian played a critical role in adding the soil organic carbon dynamics that you see here. So in many ways, that component is, I would say, relatively similar to DayCent. What SALUS is unique about it, it's really truly a crop model and has very little freedom of manipulating data in terms of, extensive calibration, and as you can only do adjustment on genetics, which also were very limited value. In fact, within most of the AgMIP exercise that we did, Salus gave the similar results, whether it was calibrated or uncalibrated, giving always being in the top models. It captures all the feedback between the plant, the soil, and the atmosphere, as you see in the graphic here below. Both Salus and Ceres, in this case mostly Ceres, has been extensively used. You see all those dots. That's a review that I wrote in Advances in Agronomy for every single variables that has been tested. And so the unique, component of Salus is a very detailed crop model, accounting for prolificacy, barrenness, genetics, genetically modify organisms, feedback to roots, and so on. So as that component that we get the soil and crop and management interaction pretty well. One thing that I really would like to show is how we use Salus. And so this is, I've been fortunate enough to have funding to be able to work closely with stakeholders, in this case, farmers and agribusiness. And so I've been able to collect a pretty extensive amount of data set, as you see there, over nearly 2,000 fields, and this is not even updated. We have almost 7,000 yield maps with imagery, and so with this information, along with management data, so how much nitrogen is applied, one of the most valuable things is that for each of the fields we have, as you see the yield map change in there, that's the database that we have. For every single field, we have a 3-dimensional with high resolution DEMs, capturing the variation on any single field, and obviously show the inefficiency of nitrogen, which is lost as N2O emissions. And so with this approach of looking at space and time, we have developed yield stability map across the entire Midwest. So you can go on any single field, and it's not a projected, it's a physical assessment based on common land unit. You can click on that field and be able to get a knowledge of how much level of productivity that is stable over time, always producing well, versus other areas always underperforming, and areas that they fluctuate from one year to the next. So the area that they fluctuate from one year to the next, they're also being assessed in terms of what are the areas that are more vulnerable to water deficit versus areas, because in the Midwest we have an issue of excess water. So how much water stands, and so be able to affect uniformity of the stands in crops, denitrification, and so on. So we quantify that basically, as you could well expect, doing the anomalies analysis with rainfall in a wet year, the areas that is more vulnerable to accumulating water has the lowest yield, as you see on the right, versus the dry years, the hilltops will not do as well. So there is a constant, nearly a 33% production, and this happens pretty much at the same time in a field throughout the year. Some parts are flooded, some parts are dry. So with this data set, we have been now able to deliver prescription maps. These prescription maps are basically amount of fertilizer that is applied to the farmers. And the graphs there with the histogram shows that basically with a uniform application, these farmers have constantly underproduced in the low and stable zones. And so, and not only that, but they lose also profit. So you see at the bottom, from a stability map, you have a loss of profit from the areas that are inefficient. They should go to precision conservation, so to alternative, and that's already the first adaptation as well as mitigation because of less emission. So one of the criteria that we use Salus to deliver the prescription rates in terms of the nitrogen rates and remote sensing for the locations of the rate. So why am I bringing this? Because basically you have areas that there is a response to nitrogen and can be used efficiently with no leaching, very little because it's still a leaky system, versus areas that you should not be under corn production. And so we have a packaged basically solution that this is an as applied map. So a farmer applies this amount that are then converted into how much saving has that particular farmer has applied. That nitrogen saving is compared to the maximum amount to the amount that is put in the high and stable zones. And so that saving is immediately converted into CO2 that is reduced. So a very great example of mitigation, as well as adaptation in terms of if you have a dry year, you won't be putting the same amount of nitrogen. And so that's converted into carbon credits. And so I recently received a large grant that basically worked closely with farmers to incentivize this adoption. And these are unmanipulated maps. So basically this could be a way of generating a significant amount of money for farmers to finally adjust their nitrogen rates, because obviously this is very specific to the US in terms of the possibility of having such a big data set and imagery and model that have been around on those fields for a very long time. So we do this in a three-dimensional mode. This is another random field where nitrogen is not applied on areas that have been constantly losing money and leaching and so on, generating this greater possibility for farmers to collect that. One example, again, of the benefits of integrating, and that's why I call it geospatial, because remote sensing and models have to go hand by hand. We are capable of capturing spatial variations, and most of the models that run spatially run on soil type. So this is an example that by running by soils, as you see the Sergo maps on the lower left, if you simulate just using soils, that's the type of simulation that you get. But if you were to use a stability zones and understanding of the interaction between landscape, positioning the landscape, management, and using Salus for that, the areas where the soil would give 220 bushels, so basically over 12 tons, it actually did not yield that amount. It actually was one of the lowest because of a wet year in a depression with a low uniformity of plants coming out. And so this is very important. So we've been able to scale now on every field by partitioning high and stable zones, low and stable, unstable depressions, hilltops, and sloping land in order to basically scale a truly adaptation and mitigation measure in terms of fertilizer in this particular example. So this is adjusted by the stability zone on every single field, savings and carbon credits, and basically this you could save up to 8 teragrams of CO2 equivalent, but this is not a projected scenario. This is basically just waiting to be cashed out for farmers to be able to enter these voluntary markets, or possibly California, and this is use the California price for carbon credits. If we were to use precision conservation or not even apply reduced amount, but just changing land use, then you would save even more because of all the benefits. And those areas could be used for generating seeds for cover crops, for example. Everybody talks about regenerative practices, be able to sequester carbon, but we cannot scale cover crop across the Midwest. There are no seeds. There's a very limited production of seeds for cover crops. And so this could be also, again, in a fully combined adaptation mitigation. So some of the scenarios that we ran with Salus, again, on field base, is what if you want to go from a conventional tillage to a no tillage to cover crops? And the beauty is, again, to be able to get data from the farmers that being from Napoli, I made them an offer that they couldn't refuse. So basically they shared the data in exchange of flying over their fields for the last 6 years. So they have greatly benefits of having imagery analyzed, both airborne or planet every single day at 3 meters resolution. So that has created a pretty strong bonds with a lot of these people. And so that has been an amazing experience for me. One more technical example that we just published, the Kello Biological Station has several 20, 30 of these rainout shelter laid out, and basically capturing the increased variability. So we simulated, as long as, we couldn't wait too long to have these experiments to go, but we ran scenarios of basically imposing droughts. So they're placed on the areas to remove rain. And so we look at the historical distribution of the rain, and with Salus, we remove the rain early stage or during basically flowering, and got results between comparing no tillage with conventional tillage, just to go all the way to the RCP6, the improved cultivars and early planting. So again, adaptation to climate, but also improved benefits because you mitigate by sequestering carbon if you were to adopt no-till, improved cultivars that they're key, and early planting. Just to conclude, another example that we use Salus for is it's actually in rotational grazing. And we combine, this is an automated system where the satellite, in this case, is the drone flying over, detecting spatial variation. Salus simulates how much growth comes from the pasture, and the animal basically go. There is a digestibility model. So we recently published this 2-3 papers on these aspects. And because animals don't have to chew down all the way to the roots of the grass, the methane emissions are reduced because they eat the tender component, then they get moved into the next basically paddock to be able to optimize their production as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the application that, again, on top of describing Salus, is how we use it in a very operational and solution-driven mode. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you very much for your contribution. I think that this is a very nice example. Sometimes we are thinking that complex models are not so useful for practical use, at least on the economic side and in the policy support. But here we see a great example of exactly the contrary, where a very complex and integrated model is applied both by the farmers and to the policymakers, which is, I think, key, because if we don't bring this somehow in a credible way to the policymakers, yeah, we
Indeed.
are only halfway. So thank you so much for this great example. And with this, I would hand over to Christoph Müller, who will present us maybe some more large-scale examples of modeling of the mitigation and adaptation with LPGML.
Yeah, good day to all. I'm hoping you can still hear me, because usually my audio goes off when I share the screen.
It's fine.
But I see you nodding, so that's fine. Okay. I was charged with presenting the AgMIP8 model to you, which is a large-scale model. So we mainly work at the global scale, as many of you already know. And I just want to quickly say a few words on the global scale applications. So we're talking MAC-B, the mitigation adaptation co-benefits, but we don't have to forget that this is actually all about sustainable development. So we need more mac and cheese maybe than MAC-B, where everything sticks together a little bit. And mitigation and adaptation are just two elements of the sustainable development in total. And then the global scale is important because the future of agriculture is also determined by global scale dynamics, mainly because there are global phenomena that link all the locations on the world with each other. And one of them is, of course, the climate system. So that's a global system, you know. Trade systems are totally global, not only with respect to agricultural commodities, but Bruno just mentioned the carbon prices, so there may also be markets for emissions and so on. Technologies are global market and communication as well. So as long as you don't have win-win-win-win only situations or solutions in your management application, as soon as there are trade-offs in the system, you have to be aware of leakages and that things move to other places, and that's not possible to address these dynamics with a local application of models or local analysis. Okay, so the AgMIP model comes from the natural vegetation carbon cycle modeling at the global scale. It basically tracks all the carbon and water fluxes between the land surface and the atmosphere, and also some energy fluxes. And because the stomata of plants, like at the leaf level, are super important, because all these carbon and water fluxes go through the leaves and through the stomata. The model has basically a detailed, very small scale processes, and these are then embedded in a very large framework of mechanic and algorithms that make the model work at the global scale. When I started my PhD, which now is quite some years ago, there was the realization that doing carbon cycle only is not the best idea, and that it needs to have human impact. So the model became from a natural vegetation carbon cycle model, it became also a full hydrology model at the global scale, so with a river routing scheme and the ability to withdraw water for different purposes. And then agricultural modules were introduced to better represent the actual carbon dynamics in the vegetation and soils, which are heavily impacted by land use. Later on, we also introduced a pretty complex representation of the nitrogen cycle to the model, and also of different management options for cropland. And by that, the model became able to address these kind of questions with respect to different adaptation and mitigation measures, and also how different management features play out in different regions at different times, and with respect to the effects on adaptation and mitigation targets. Just to incentivize you to take a look yourself at the model. So this is a widely used model. I created a Google Scholar profile just for the model to show you that it's widely used in science. And here you see the mostly cited papers are basically water applications and crop applications. So the second paper here is the AgMIP application of the model, and here's Santol's AgMIP paper. So AgMIP is also an important customer of the APGML model, and it's also an open source model. So you're very welcome to find it at GitHub, download the code. Be aware it's a very complex model, so it's not plug and play, unfortunately, and we can't provide any support outside agreed collaborations. Usually that means funding, but you're very welcome to take a look, and there are a few groups around the world that successfully apply the model in their own environment. Just to highlight this point that co-benefits also needs to be assessed with trade-offs. So there's not just that one makes the other better, but also that one comes at the expense of the other, and that that requires that there are local solutions, basically addressing the different local environmental and socioeconomic conditions at hand. And I don't want you to understand these maps. I just want you to see that the maps have basically red areas and green areas, and that different management systems, which is what these 4 maps show, don't play out in the same way in different places in the world. And for example, the age of the cropland, so how long the land has been already cultivated as cropland, also plays an important role in the ability to sequester carbon under different management systems. And then if we have conflicting targets or conflicting dynamics, so not these win-win-win-win situations, then we need someone making a decision what they prefer over other things. So stakeholder interaction, and basically our results need to enable stakeholders to make an informed decision of, okay, I sacrifice this target because I value that target over the other one, or I try to find a compromise between these, or whatever it is. And that requires a lot of information provided. And even if the information is that we don't know for sure, that is super important for the decision process. And here you can see also like a measure that typically tends to increase carbon sequestration rates sometimes comes as with a penalty on crop yields. So most farmers would decide for not applying that technique. But if you have other schemes that incentivize the carbon sequestration, like a carbon price that can be paid to farmers, then that may change the picture. This is just to remind me to tell you that, of course, at the global scale, a few things are very or more complicated, more difficult to model, and aspects of adaptation and mitigation are more complicated than others. And this is just showing, like, all dots should be on this 1-to-1 line, the black line in the middle, and as you see, they're not. So if you think that modeling crop yields is complicated, try modeling N2O emissions, which is much more complicated also to measure. And that is also a tremendous challenge to the modeling community to really give up on the well-established aspects of model application, like crop yields. Everyone has seen applications of models, and we are fairly content with the level of certainty that we can provide. But then moving into much more volatile dynamics like N2O emissions is discouraging to some extent, because model performance decreases dramatically. It's much more dependent on detailed soil information, on detailed management aspects. And I just want to say, don't be discouraged by it, but use that also to promote the requesting additional data on management systems. And if we are asked, if we can show that models in principle work, but they do not work in many conditions, that hopefully also starts a collaboration between people having data, having understanding of specific management systems and modelers, and bringing them together. And I think AgMIP is the place where this could happen. Already my last slide. So future directions. I think crop modeling needs to go human decision making, and we often ignore that in like bluntly, completely, that farmers react to what happens in the field. Sometimes we have scenarios on that, like all farmers do no-tillage systems, or all farmers do this and all farmers do that. But as Bruno nicely illustrated in his very detailed application, where farmers really collaborate with the models, I think we need to enable models to also make decisions as farmers and other decision makers would do. And one of these activities where this happens is this integrated assessment modeling, where we have good linkages to the MAGPIE and Remind team here in-house at PIC, but also the APJML model is an integral part of the image model in the Netherlands, and we are in very intense collaboration with the global economics team in AgMIP. But generally, I think all this management and needs a much better understanding of how decisions are made. And the left-hand side of this slide shows the result of an activity we had on sustainable intensification, yet another of these buzzwords that go into the mac and cheese. And just looking on what different themes and metrics belong to these two terms, intensification and sustainability, and we find more than 1,000 different metrics describing aspects of this. And all of these metrics are relevant to some stakeholders. And of course, all of these metrics cannot be addressed with a single model. They also cannot be addressed with a suite of models. But being able to very clearly say we can address these metrics and we cannot address those also enables decision making on the decision maker's side, and interaction with them would greatly improve our model capacities and guide our model development. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Christoph, for bringing in the global dimension. Actually, in the economic modeling, we are sometimes thinking about how the regional models or the local models could maybe help to improve the global models. Maybe something also for what this project could be a great platform also on the crop modeling. And with this, we go to our last speaker, Pete Smith. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. So I'm going to be talking about the mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. And I've been asked to look, without presenting a specific model, to just look at some of the key model and data needs. I'm going to be very quick. I've only got 3 slides to show, so I hope to claw back some of the time that we've lost going through the afternoon or the morning. So the first thing to note is that we need quite different information for mitigation and adaptation. So this is the key that was to a figure that appeared in the special report on climate change and land. If you look at this first column, what we were doing was trying to look at the global mitigation potential of different measures and practices. So these were all different agronomic practices, food supply interventions, food system interventions. And we quantified the mitigation potential in terms of the number of gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year that was delivered by a specific intervention. And we broke it down into these categories, which are rather arbitrary. But when you look at the adaptation column, the best way to assess this was to have a look at the number of people that were positively or negatively impacted by a given intervention. So we're already getting into the crux of the problem, which I think Christoph also went through a few of these in his examples, is that the mitigation is actually quite easy. So for biogeochemical models that are bolted on the bottom of crop models, or for models like Century and DNDC, which have biogeochemical models, we just need to output the greenhouse gas emissions and the soil carbon change, and we can apply the model spatially, and we can add those all up, and we get a number in CO2 equivalents per year. So although that's quite a difficult thing to do, conceptually it's quite easy because we're dealing with units that we know, and we're dealing directly with outputs from the models that we understand. But adaptation is much harder. If we try to assess the number of people that are positively or negatively affected by a measure, we need to know lots of things that contribute to adaptation and resilience. So human well-being, effects on health, effects on economics, the effects on women and children and other disadvantaged groups need to be considered. And most of these, of course, aren't the outputs of the models that we tend to use within the AgMIP community. So for mitigation, so what do we need from the models first? Looking at the models, so I was asked to look at data, but I'm also thinking of data as model outputs. Model outputs are also a form of data that are used in decision making. But for mitigation, we're used to doing this. They're methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, or soil carbon change. And maybe we'll want to output yield if we want to calculate the emissions intensity, the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of yield. But for adaptation, we're a number of steps away from measuring the human benefit. But here are some examples of things that we can output, which contribute, they're indicators of adaptive capacity or adaptation, even though they're not the whole thing. So we can output things like yield stability. How does that vary over time? We can try to output the resilience to climate shocks or extreme events, and we have a mixed ability to do that. And I think that we also need to consider the future effects of climate change, for example, on pests and diseases, which we have some capability of doing, but I think it could be better. So in terms of the data and model capabilities we need for modeling mitigation and adaptation, I think for the data inputs, we largely need the same sort of data to input to the model. So it's all the things that we use regularly in AgMIP comparisons and in other biogeochemical comparisons. We need to know the crop that's in, we need to know the management, we need to know the history of the management, we need to know the soil, we need to know the meteorology. So we can get all of this data and we can model that, and we can output some model outputs will be useful for mitigation, and some of them will be useful for adaptation. And I'll say that some model capabilities are useful for both mitigation and adaptation modeling. So for example, if we can output soil carbon or changes in soil carbon, that helps us, it's a headline indicator for soil quality or soil health. And that's useful for both mitigation and adaptation. So if we know that we're sequestering carbon, that's a certain amount of CO2 that we're sequestering from the atmosphere. But we can also get a measure of whether we're improving our soil quality or reducing degradation. And that's also a measure of adaptation. Similarly, with yield and yield stability, I think that the outputs there are useful for both mitigation and adaptation. As I mentioned earlier, for calculating the yield, the emissions intensity of a product, but for adaptation too, in that we know how resilient a system will be to future climate change and to future climate extremes. But we still have a way to go to relate those to the all of the metrics we need. But some of the model capabilities are very different for mitigation and adaptation modeling. So I think the ability to model entire crop loss due to extreme weather is much more difficult. We have great models that can predict what will happen under climate change and what will happen under a slow drought or an increased heat event and how that will reduce yield. But some of these extreme events that happen on particular fields, for example, a hailstorm, a windstorm, excessive rain, a particular drought, can be very difficult to model. So when we lose the entire crop, this of course has disastrous consequences for adaptation and the resilience of people living in those systems and relying on those agricultural outputs. And they can in fact lose their entire income for a year. And I think that we're not sufficiently good yet at modeling those sorts of outcomes. Our ability to model disease and pest outbreaks is improving all the time, but I think that we could make further changes there. And I think we can apply some of our models for the wider resilience impacts. So some of the models have the ability to look at economic return when they're coupled to economic models, or when we do a post-model analysis to work out what the economics return will be. That will be useful. But then we have some difficult things which we find difficult to model. So for example, we have a differential impact maybe on women or disadvantaged groups. We have other environmental outcomes. So it's come up in the session today that we need to model the impacts of the cropping systems on other ecosystem services. And I think we've got a long way to go there. And we also have to consider trade. So some of these problems can be solved by trade or aid, but I don't think we currently model those very effectively. So for adaptation, I think one of the key recommendations would be, looking at it from the outside, from outside the AgMIP community, is that we maybe need to engage with people who understand what factors into resilience and human well-being and good livelihoods, good sustainable livelihoods. These tend to be a different community from the communities that we're used to interacting with, but they understand and they know what factors contribute to adaptation. So I think we could benefit from engaging more closely with those communities which have very different expertise to ourselves, and we could greatly benefit from interacting with those additional areas of expertise. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete, for bringing up in this nice systematic way the comparison between the mitigation and adaptation challenges to the modeling. I think it's very right on the indicator side. And another thing which comes to my mind are all these technical options which we, I think, scoped kind of at the global scale for the mitigation, but we are lacking so far such a comprehensive database for the adaptation options at the global scale. Thank you very much. And I see that in the Q&A we have only one unanswered question, which I think can be maybe taken by some colleagues from the AgMIP leadership. But besides that, all the questions have been answered, and I realize that we are lagging behind the time. So I think with this, I have to hand over back to Cynthia, maybe.
Yes,
Thank you very much again to all the panelists for the great contributions.
Thank you, Peter, and all the modelers for such great presentations, and for Pete to really set us on, I think, on important ways forward. So I'm popping in because we've tried in this agenda to basically take a 3-day workshop and condense it to 3 hours, and we're not able to do that. So what we've decided to do is extend the time of the workshop until 1 p.m. New York time. We understand completely if breakout leaders and participants aren't able to do it, but we promise to catch everyone up through the workshop report and via email. What we are going to do is now, before noon, go to our keynote talk from Jean-François Susanna. And then we will proceed to have a real working session in the breakout groups. And then maybe we could take, we'll see how our timing is, but then we'll be able to then come back for report backs, and so we're not rushing. This happens in AgMIP workshops. We often are, as I said at the beginning, I don't know if any of you heard, but this is how AgMIP workshops actually are. We need to speak to each other even more now when we can't meet in person. So with that, let me turn back to, is it Roberto who's going to introduce Jean-François, or Sonali?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. If anybody, we understand people have to leave. Don't worry, we're going to have a workshop report. We're going to follow up. It's being so great to be all together to discuss clearly this very, very important topic for modeling the mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. It's clearly what we as researchers and modelers really need to be doing to come together at this time. So thanks, everybody. And whoever can stay, please stay till 1 p.m. Thank you.
Hey, great. And just in preface, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Jean-François Susanna currently serves as the Vice Chair for International Policy at the French National Institute of Agriculture, Food and the Environment, or INRA. He has a doctorate in plant physiology and has led a research unit on grassland ecosystems and global change. He coordinates national and European research projects and international programs on agriculture, soils, and climate change, and he's been a member of the IPCC since 1998. And a highly cited researcher to that end. Dr. Susanna has published over 150 refereed research papers in international journals, and he has shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 as a lead author of the IPCC 4th Assessment Report, and has been awarded national and international distinctions. So without further ado, Dr. Susanna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonali. So I'll share my screen, and I will be glad to say a few words about the global context of mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. Obviously, as you all realize, this is really a huge topic, and I'm just going to try to navigate you through this international context. It is interesting to note that agriculture has been a highly contentious issue in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC.
Jean-François, sorry to interrupt, Jean-François. Can you put it onto the slideshow mode?
Yes, I tried.
So try it again. Yeah, well, we're seeing the presenter view. Just do it again. And
is it better?
No. Yeah, so
okay.
no, on the top left corner, again, I'm going to try to say paramètres d'affiche.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here it is it?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for this. Yes, I was just saying that in the context of the UNFCCC, agriculture has been a highly contentious issue, basically because of a sort of a north-south divide on issues like the relative weight of adaptation versus mitigation. Quite clearly, the developing countries have been extremely reluctant to consider that they should have some mitigation efforts in agriculture. And this is highly understandable, I think. However, quite recently, there was a first substantive COP decision, Conference of Parties decision, with an agenda item on agriculture. And this was a request to the subsidiary bodies of the conference to address issues related to agriculture, taking into consideration vulnerability, food security, and both adaptation and mitigation. So without entering into all details, you see that issues about adaptation co-benefits and resilience, soil carbon, but also nutrient use, livestock management, and socioeconomics have been addressed through a series of discussions. And interestingly, in this Coronivia process, there were discussions between negotiators and scientists, which I think is really great. So you can see here the agenda, which took some time, and the conclusions should be reported at COP26. And as you know, COP26 has been postponed to November 2021, given the COVID-19 situation. Well, because we have also in the UNFCCC some financial mechanisms, and especially the Green Climate Fund, there are some possibilities to have large-scale funding about projects dealing with both adaptation and mitigation. It is fair to say that in this Green Climate Fund, agriculture is a significant component. It is a bit difficult to give some precise values because it depends whether you consider it's about funding or it's about the number of projects. But we feel that the share of agriculture in that funding could increase if the monitoring, reporting, and verification was strengthened. Quite usually, there are some weaknesses in the way the reporting can be organized in the agricultural sector compared to other sectors like, say, industry. And this weakens the base for funding those projects because there are some concerns in the agencies, in the funds, that in fact the projects may not reach their targets in terms of mitigation. And this also happens with the World Bank and Global Environment Fund. So I think it is quite clear that if we can support the evidence base of those projects, if we can support the monitoring, reporting, verification systems, we could make significant progress in terms of funding. This was already mentioned by Pete, and this is one of the key results of the IPCC special report on climate change and land, and this work was led, this figure was led by Pete. And you can see here the co-benefits between mitigation and adaptation for a range of response options based on land management without changing land use. And when you see blue colors, this means you have some positive impacts or co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation, but this extends to other dimensions like desertification, land degradation, and food security. So you see that increased food productivity, quite largely because of land sparing, but also agroforestry and increased soil organic carbon content achieve, in fact, co-benefits across all dimensions. However, some other options may not achieve the same level of co-benefits. And we've been studying also some other dimensions in this chapter of the report, including water issues and including biodiversity. And the situation is indeed quite complex because there's not only climate change with land, but there are several other issues. And I'll not try to enter into the details, but here are maps of other issues, other challenges for land: desertification, land degradation, food insecurity, loss of biodiversity, groundwater stress, and loss of water quality. We've been looking into how those challenges overlap. And you see the number of overlapping challenges is really high in some world regions, like in South Asia. And actually, when you cross that map with a map of the Human Development Index, you see that the lower the Human Development Index, the higher the number of challenges. So not only are there world regions where challenges are quite numerous, but also the response capacity is relatively lower. And with this kind of knowledge of where are the challenges and what are the interactions between response options and challenges, we can tentatively draw maps on a global scale on how options would create co-benefits across local challenges plus mitigation in some world regions, and this is plotted in blue, or would have negligible effects, this is in light blue, or would have, in fact, some trade-offs with those responses. I think you will not find the trade-offs, the negative trade-offs, but with responses like bioenergy and BECCS, you would find trade-offs. And obviously, some of the responses cannot be applied on barren lands, for instance. So this is a sort of knowledge we are developing, and largely through this global effort that happened with IPCC special report. But it's fair to say that it is quite difficult when you enter into the real world to know how this could be applied. Because mostly when you talked with some stakeholders in agriculture, they are not so familiar with this idea that you would deploy responses for adaptation and mitigation. The sort of applied framework that is discussed at FAO and in other of the agencies is about climate smart agriculture, which has been defined, I'll go back to this later, as a combination of resilience and also mitigation and food security. Or another option, which is sustainable intensification. So how would you increase food productivity while keeping environmental dimensions in a safe space? And agroecology, which is referring, in fact, to better using the ecosystem regulations into agriculture. So here again in the IPCC chapter, we've been working on this table with Pete and others, showing how the responses can be more or less encompassed in those overall frameworks. And you see, in fact, many of the responses are indeed part of those frameworks. So there is a debate, in fact, in the agencies about those concepts. And for instance, some countries are more in favor of sustainable intensification or climate smart agriculture, and others are more in favor of agroecology. This may sound a bit confusing, but in fact, it's like people challenging, you have here the definitions for climate smart agriculture and for agroecology. And when comparing CSA and agroecology, this is from a study that was led by CCAFs, it is said that possibly CSA, climate smart agriculture, could pay too much attention to technologies and not enough to traditional practices. It is also questioned whether agroecology pays explicit attention to climate change issues. But on the other hand, promoters of agroecology think that it creates a more system-wide thinking on how to integrate adaptation and mitigation within food systems. So this is just here again to navigate you on how those concepts are currently used and discussed in some of the international dimensions. So I'll try to stop there and just provide you with a few take-home messages. We can see today that there are large funding sources, really with green finance, for projects with co-benefits on mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. But such projects need to have strong mechanisms in place to have monitoring, reporting, verification of additional effects on increasing soil carbon and reducing greenhouse gases while providing adaptation. I don't think that it is so easy to have projects now that are just about adaptation and resilience. Quite often the question will be what are in fact the effects on climate, what are the climate feedbacks of the project, so you have to work also on that dimension. And this is clearly why it is important for the science community to converge on working together between adaptation and mitigation. We do see from the global scale IPCC reports that some of the integrative responses for agriculture have mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. But however, we have so far limited knowledge at the regional and local scales on the potential of such integrative responses. So downscaling what the IPCC has done to regional and local scales and understanding the socio-economic dimensions, how would adoption happen, is something that definitely requires further work. And I trust that joint work in the future between the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases and AgMIP can be critical to support the design of large-scale projects funded by green finance and by countries or supported by countries. This requires, as we have stated for this session, multimodal protocols for integrated biophysical and socioeconomic assessments that would combine mitigation and adaptation. I think this would also require a remote sensing dimension. So having, for instance, monitoring, reporting, verification, combining modeling, combining remote sensing. And I'm really glad to see that in this session, we are making progress and also creating mutual understanding, both from, let's say, experts in modeling, experts in data, experts in mitigation or adaptation, but also from the regions, people working in the regions on these issues, and that may need scientific support for creating this change that needs to be guided by evidence and by science. So thank you very much. Back to you, Sonali.
Yes, thank you so much for that comprehensive discussion, Jean-Francois. I think, so we will be moving to breakout shortly. I think we have time for just 1 to 2 more questions, given the extent of what you've presented. And let me just look at the Q&A. Any questions? Please do drop it into the chat or the Q&A here. Cynthia, I know you're coming online.
Yes, I'm coming online. Jean-Francois, thank you so much for that, as you said, guidance and navigating the really quite complex global pathways, but still so necessary. So turning specifically to the GRA AgMIP activity, how do you see, next steps? What, how can we be in a concrete way really helping to move forward?
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. So that's really what we try to create. And I know that we have Hayden Montgomery in this session from the GRA. So please, Hayden, if you are still with us, feel free to also contribute to this answer. I think I'm just amazed, I must say, by what AgMIP8 is doing. So I'm really very optimistic now, because in AgMIP8 we have seen some interest on those issues of emissions, but also of food shocks, food security. So now the scope of the initiative gets much bigger. So with this, and with, I think, the tremendous support the GRA can bring, given that GRA is guided by countries. In the GRA we have, it's always increasing, so I'm always late with the values, but it's at least 60 countries, I think. So with this, we can, I think, together we could try to approach some of the agencies, and we could try to get really support for something which would be project scale guidance. I think what all the funders are struggling with is how can you create a framework that is going to be able to assess ex ante first, but also then during the development of the project, what are the impacts? So ex ante, what you will need is some modeling. That would be very powerful. What is currently done is really extremely rough by the FAO and other agencies. So I think the scientific community could really step in and provide something that would be of a higher accuracy in some sense, or at least providing better understanding. And then you need to work obviously with the data that will be collected during the project for the reporting, but also the verification. And that can be strongly supported by remote sensing. So I see this as something where we could really create a breakthrough if we work together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean-François. Actually, Hayden, if you are on, maybe this would be a good time to give some views before noon, because we may be leaving, we may be losing some of our participants at noon, but we hope as many people as possible can stay on. See if Hayden is around. Not sure. Just to say, as we come to our noon, what we plan to do is build on this wonderful workshop, all the material, very substantive. I think, so Hayden is back, but I'll finish my thought and then ask Hayden to just give a few words from the GRA perspective of what you've heard so far. What we're going to do is take all the very rich material, including the questions and answers from that have been active from the participants, and take the next step from the draft white paper concept note that went into this workshop, and work to develop this further to create a draft framework, draft protocols, and with some examples of some potential pilot projects. And this will be shared with GRA first and foremost, but then we hope then perhaps to the to the countries and international funding agencies to really move this forward. And also and part of that paper will be eventually, I've just been chatting with Pete Smith, and we do want to do a peer-reviewed journal article about this topic as well. So that's where we're going. That's where I see where we're going. Jean-François, thanks so much for your inputs. Hayden, can you just say a few words from the GRA perspective?
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I was just away from my computer for a moment.
No
I heard my name and I came. Well, yeah, it's difficult to speak for the whole GRA, but I guess from what I've heard is there's a huge potential, right, to bring these two communities together more closely. Not only is there a huge potential, I think, as Jean-François illustrated in his presentation, with the finance out there and what would be needed to secure that finance. I think it's essential these two communities come together to be able to mobilize that finance for maximum benefit. I've also seen a lot of the questions coming through, and a lot have been asking about capability building and support for students and postdocs and researchers. Some of those were answered by, I think, Carolyn and maybe some others, but perhaps in the report of this, we can also make available some other opportunities that exist through the GRA framework for various levels of capability and training, including active PhD students, postdocs, master's level as well, within different regions and also just globally. We have a number of interesting programs that are up and running, and hopefully can return to some normalcy after, I'm not sure when after, but if COVID allows us to start moving around the world a bit more. So I think, I can't really add much value, I don't think. It's been really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of potential and there's a lot of work that could be done. And we've heard a lot of the co-benefits that go beyond mitigation and get into the societal, cultural and other things, other environmental benefits as well, which of course are important. But I guess we need to decide how much we try and constrain this work to the mitigation question and greenhouse gas coupling with adaptation. notwithstanding the importance of the rest, and maybe think about also the key model improvements that, or the highest priority maybe model improvements that could be looked into, that would be of value to as wider community as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayden. Yes, very good. Yes, if we try to do everything, we end up doing nothing. So we can't do everything. So we definitely have to really focus in on what is it that we can do as we bring as really the logical first steps as we bring the two communities together. And then also always, you know, the I in AgMIP is not just inter-comparison, it's improvement as well. And we have a few more I's that came out in AgMIP8, including innovation. You know, we're always, from the modeling community, we always are pushing the models, are interested in improving the models. So thanks Jean-Francois, thanks Hayden. And now we're going to go into our breakout groups. Sonali and Roberto are going to, and Eric are going to get us there. We understand if for those who have to leave now, we will, don't worry, we will catch you up. All right, Sonali, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, let me share my screen here briefly. Okay, so I think you should be able to see my screen now. So we're going to motivate our charge to breakouts now, which I believe I'll specify the time in just a second. But first, a few key questions to guide the breakouts, and we will also these should be on the agenda that was circulated across the panelists. We are going to have a few changes in breakout leaders given the time, so we will email this around to everybody, the breakout leaders and the new breakout leaders as well, so that you'll have it on hand while you're coordinating. So firstly, we're asking you to focus on as many of these questions as you can. Firstly, what specific MACB projects might be supported in the region? We've heard about a few today and a few ideas. So we're asking you to maybe focus on a few of those and just identify what that key focus for that project might be across both mitigation and adaptation and the co-benefits. We also ask that you consider who might be potential collaborating partners within your regions, or even more broadly, taking advantage of some key opportunities. And to that end, we ask you to also think about the role of organizations, inclusive of the GRA, development groups, and the relevant funds in supporting these projects. So both regional partners and how you might go about involving broader organizations that are thinking about this in a more global context. And then finally, how can a modeling framework, in particular a regional modeling framework, given that this is our focus for now, an assessment, contribute to policy development for incentivizing mitigation and adaptation? I think Sabine gave a really good description of how that engagement needs to be structured. So not just the modeling, but also the co-development of knowledge with stakeholders and the relevant parties for decision-making purposes. So those are the questions by which we structure the breakout. You know, we hope that you can get to them all. If not, I would suggest maybe focusing on a few of those key questions, particularly the project identification, that we might build off of later. And in terms of the actual groups now, this will change a little bit. We have a South Asia group facilitated by Drs. Gita Lakshmi and Anthony Whitbread, who I believe are both available at this time. We have a Southeast Asian group by Drs. Trin and Ruane, who will be leading that. Our Latin American group will have Kelly Witkowski. Francisco did have to leave, I believe. I'm not sure if he's still on, but I think we'll also have Roberto join that group as well too. And for Africa, Sabine will be there. Ibrahima, I think, may be there for a little bit, Dr. Ibrahim Mahati. However, he might have to leave. And so Dr. Dillis McCarthy might join us along with a few others. So that might be moving a little bit as we head to breakouts. Please check the links on the most updated program that you have and join the breakout using that link. As for timing, I'm gonna maybe quickly ask Eric and others to join in here. I think we're looking at about somewhere 12:35, 12:40 to reconvene at this point.
I think let's do 12:40. We want to give people time to talk. So I think if we come back at 12:40, then that'll give it time for a brief report backs. By the way, each breakout group needs to choose a rapporteur to give some sense of the answers, the discussion around at least some of the questions, please. So how does that sound? 12:40?
Yeah. I think that sounds well. It sounds good because and people will need time to transition. So, so please do. We'll be closing this session shortly. Please do join your breakout groups. As Cynthia said, please select a rapporteur, and we will be emailing around these questions again, just so that you have them to the breakout leaders, just so that you have them as you're moving through the discussion. So I think with that, unless there's anything else from our leadership team, I think
the chats were just posted in the chat. I mean, the Zoom links to the breakouts were just posted in the chat.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. Well,
all right. Have a good discussion, everyone.
Yes.
See you later.